So thank you, Paul Kemp, for joining me here today to talk about Nike's Big Bet documentary you have coming up with the, I guess, premiere Thursday,
That's right. Yeah.
release Thursday. And so you've covered a broad range of subject matter in your different documentaries, like Deadly Sins, Portrait of War, Dog Tales, Gossip, UFO Town. So I know you're a former runner or former athlete, but what is it about Alberto Salazar and the Nike Oregon Project that made you want to cover this subject this time?
That's a good question. I mean, I've been doing films for films and television actually for 24 years. Mainly television, actually. I left a company I was with for 20 years I was there from 95 to 2016, and did lots of films inside of there, but really was a TV showrunner and director and writer. But in 2016, I saw myself, I wanted to remake myself. I started my own company, and I wanted to start looking at films that kind of more interested in me. Beyond just the crass, let's just leave it this, the crass TV world. There's lots of films you could do. I could do home and garden shows. I could do cooking shows. There's all those opportunity to do it. But I really like investigative documentaries. So the last 4 or 5 years, I spent a lot of time doing some bigger pictures shows for CBC. I've done 5 films for CBC in the last 3 or 4 years. And they've been doing fairly well. So I've looked at everything from Indigenous affairs. I did a film called Transformer with Michael Del Monte, who's a former runner. You might know him. He was a national university champion. He's a great director. And we did a film on the world's strongest man who was turning into a woman. And it's on Netflix in the States. It's done really well. And so just exploring those sort of things. So I've never done a film on track and field though, or on running, or something that I was so passionate in my life outside of my work. Like I've always been making films on all sorts of different subjects, but I also ran on the side and competed on the side. I was still a masters runner until probably like 2015, 2016. I was still running competitively. And I just decided, when I saw the Salazar story hit the news, I'd been following the story of the Nike Oregon Project since its inception, just as a fan of the sport, just as a guy who understands track and field. I've been in the sport since 1981. So I was 11 years old, and I started competing when I was in grade 6. So Salazar was the best runner in the world when I was a kid. I remember watching him on TV winning the New York City Marathon. And then he wins the Boston Marathon. Then he goes on to this crazy career as the best coach in the world. And there was always rumors about this guy. Is he a cheat? Is he is he pushing the limits? Does he treat women right? And then he gets banned all of a sudden in 2019. And there was so much, to anybody who follows track and field, they know that this was a huge story, like massive story. I mean, I don't think people when you go back and look at the number of athletes this guy's coached that got to the top was just fat. Like it's just astronomical odds that he would have that many people at the top. And so I was interested in the story, and quite frankly, I didn't know if there would be enough interest to get it financed. So I wrote it up right after he got banned in October of he got banned in October 1st, 2019. He gets banned. I actually had a deal in hand by December 1st from the German national broadcaster. They were very interested in this story because Constance Klosterhoven had joined the club. And there was a lot of controversy over that. Like, why would she join a guy who's a cheater, And I said, well, maybe he's not a cheater. Maybe he's been handed, him and Nike are going to the wall to fight for his reputation. And I said, well, why don't we explore this film? So immediately Germany jumped on, and then Sky UK jumped on. Sky's the largest sports network in Britain, and all of a sudden I'm like, wow, I might have some cash to get this thing done and look into this. And within a few months, I was basically financed on the film, and I went at it for about a year. So,
Well, you bring up an interesting comment there, because I was going to ask you, uh, as you mentioned, that the story blew up. It was huge and still is kind of huge. New York Times has covered it in writing, and The Guardian, and Washington Post, I believe, and much other media is tagged onto that as well. ARD TV, uh, out of Germany, I think
yep.
that's who you're probably referring to, did the initial documentary asking the question, is Alberto Salazar with the Nike Oregon Project cheating? And that,
Yeah, ARD did a piece on him, and so did the BBC. BBC4 did one on their show Panorama. They did a big expose on him. I actually found the Panorama show interesting, but it left out a lot, in my view. It didn't look at a lot of other things that they could have looked at, which I feel my film has done. ARD actually did the expose on actually the story out of Ethiopia, Yama Aden, the Yama Aden story about, they broke the story, and a Spanish broadcaster also broke the story
Sabadell
of
Spain.
Mo Farah training with these guys who found all this, paraphernalia in the hotel. But ARD, yeah, they've been following the story. But I'm actually working with the national broadcaster ZDF. Actually, they're a big, they're a huge public broadcaster, the largest public broadcaster in Europe, actually. And they do investigative series called ZDF Zoom, and they investigate these things. And so that's the strand that the film's going to go on just before the Olympics. It's actually going to air on July 20th. So it'll be a different edit, obviously, for the German audience. But so you're right. The Europeans have been oddly obsessed with Alberto Salazar, more than you might think. I think people in North America might not know that, but he's very well known. I've already got deals in Denmark, all of the Netherlands and Scandinavia is already offered on the film. France, national broadcaster bought it. So yeah, it's picking up. So this weirdly North American Nike Oregon Project story is actually selling around the world. Israel picked it up last week as well. Like, weird. I actually didn't know that. I have a distributor who really knows that market, and they're saying it's hitting the mark. So we'll see how
perhaps,
it does.
yeah, perhaps it has to do with the fact that America, and then of course Russia too, over the years have won all the medals, the lion's share, and so they're, when you're on top, you're a target, rightly or wrongly, and it's an antagonist in the story, right? America and Nike, the biggest apparel company, or seemingly they're antagonists. So a couple of big bad guys, really, America and the Nike Oregon Project, but also there's a connection with, you mentioned the German athlete, but there's also Mo Farah. I mean, he was as big a name as Usain Bolt, and being a Brit, I think.
Absolutely. In Europe, he is massively, like, I mean, he won how many European championships? He was a 4-time gold medalist, and he left he left Britain to join Salazar, and he went from being, like, I remember watching him before in 2010 and going, this guy's really good. He was running like 332, 333 for a 1500. I'm like, wow, this guy looks like he's got more to him. And then Salazar takes him to the top, like within a year and a half. I mean, this guy becomes well, he was unbeatable almost for 5 years. I mean, he got beaten in the 10,000 once, but you couldn't beat him in a championship race, right? And so there's always been suspicions about Mo, but he's also incredibly talented guy, and I think he probably just needed the guidance of a great coach to hone him in and become a dominating guy on the track. I mean, he hasn't run the fastest times ever, but he certainly, as a championship athlete, I don't think there's very many athletes in the world history that can match up to Mo Farah. So yeah, you're right. Europe knows Mo Farah, and and that helps. Klosterhoven was a young talent, but she's a German champion, and she's got a good chance of even this summer to get a medal in the 5,000 meters. I think. I don't know if she's choosing the 5 or the 10, but she's still in the club. The Nike Oregon project, which was disbanded in October 2019, is now morphed into an unnamed club run by Pete Julian, and she seems to be running well. She just ran the national record in the 10,000 in Austin just a few weeks ago. So
Yeah, and she does have that Doha medal as well, to her credit.
oh yeah, ran great, and
Good talent.
she's a real talent for sure. And yeah, so we'll like again, Salazar's his legacy goes far beyond the U.S. border, even though what the Nike Oregon project was in 2001 when he started it was really to get U.S. marathoners back to the top and in the world, because they were off like for about 20 years. No Americans were nowhere in distance running, and I think what I do quite well in the film is actually show the growth of the program and how it really impacts the rest of America's distance running, which I think anyone who's watching knows that America's distance runners they're getting close to the medal podium, if not on the medal podium now in a lot of events. And that never happened until Salazar and the Nike Oregon project put their money where the mouth was and financed this program that has now spun off all sorts of other programs. Bowerman's been doing great. Inside of Nike, the Oregon Track Club was quite successful. And then also all the other brands are now jumping in, like Puma's throwing huge money at it right now. And you've got the Reebok team starting with all the young guys like Justin Knight and Ben Flanagan, those kind of guys. So I think it's been great for the sport, to tell you the truth. I mean, for all the controversy around the Nike Oregon project, Nike has lit a spark under track and field that I think is burning pretty brightly, and I think it will continue for a long time. So I just wish more fans would come to the sport and build the sport, and I think that some of the things the big bad Nike, it's a cynical, some people are cynical about Nike, but I also think you can be cynical about them, but they also like, if we didn't have Nike, track wouldn't exist, and I think people have to reflect on that. And like, I mean, they're the number one backers of the IOC. They support the Diamond League. The USATF, like the Track and Field Association, basically run by their deal with Nike. I mean, these are massive corporation that has an impact on a sport far beyond any brand that's ever supported the sport.
Yeah, and if we put aside all the negative connotations and allegations and what have you, they are, there's that so-called great American story about making it. They started, as we all know, making with Bowerman using his wife's waffle iron to make waffle shoes, and that's a lot of people forget or don't know that it's a great American business story.
Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman have changed the world of running, and there's no doubt about it. Like, I mean, in the film, I speak to Bob Williams, who was a former Oregon athlete under Bill Bowerman and was one of the first athletes to ever put on one of those shoes, and they just loved them, right? And I mean, anyone who's read Shoe Dog with Phil Knight knows that, I mean, the first 7 or 8 years, he didn't make a cent. He was like living on nothing, trying to make that company go. And by 70, I think they started pulling a profit in 76, 77. Like, it's crazy. That company sort of starts, the germs of it start in the 60s. And by 1980, I spoke to a guy who's in the film. He told me, this didn't make the edit, but it was interesting that they sent a team of guys up to the Commonwealth Games in 1978 in Edmonton, and they had one athlete signed to Nike, and I think they walked out of there with 40 athletes signed to Nike. And it was like the turning point for Nike on the international stage, because they did brand themselves as potentially a global brand. And this is before Michael Jordan signs and does all those things that just rocket them to the top. But as a shoe brand, they did want to get there, and Phil Knight was just ruthless in doing it, and he did it. I mean, it's like the Just Do It story is like not a joke, and they still are the biggest brand. But what I like about Nike, I mean, I have criticism, like people can watch the film, and there are some criticisms of them, but they're also an incredibly innovative company. I mean, they've been at the forefront of changing the sport continually.
It sounds like you're a bit of a fan of the great story of the development of Nike and all that. But we come to this documentary. You must be asking some questions in it. And before you answer, you've read Win at All Costs by Matt.
Sure.
Yes.
I have read his book. I agree with a lot of it, and I disagree with some of it. So I'll leave it at that. I want people to watch this. I think they're going to be surprised at what I've uncovered. It will be at the Hot Docs Festival. Like, I don't know when this is airing. This 29th, you can, for 8 days, the Hot Docs Festival, you can buy a ticket and actually watch the feature documentary, which is now there. And they're pushing it hard. Hot Docs thinks it's one of the, I don't know how they gauge these things, but there was almost 3,000 entries, 3,000 or 4,000 entries. 200 got in the festival, and we've been picked as one of the top 9 to be at it's called Hot Docs for Schools and for Seniors, and it's a special program that will allow people who are in school to actually watch the film, or teachers can actually grab it, but they have to watch it during the festival. And then once after the festival's over, it will be on CBC, I think in July. They haven't told me which date, but it'll be just before the Olympics. But yeah, you're right. Like, I mean, the Win at All Costs book deals with just how they dealt with, like, well, everyone knows the story, and I deal with this, is the Mary Kane story, dealing with pregnancy and runners, how they often can bully people into being in races or not being in races. We've all heard all these sort of stories. I try and look at it through the story of Salazar himself a little bit more, but yes, there are people in my film. Kara Goucher's a big character in my film. Dathan Ritzenheim's in the film. Jake Riley, who's a U.S. Olympian's in it. Chris Derrick's in the film. Who else is in the film? It's several of the beginning members of the Nike Oregon Project are in the film. Coaches that have coached with Salazar. I have a guy who actually wrote a book with Salazar, a guy named Rick Lovett. He's written 2 books with Salazar. So I tried to get a glimpse of him from all these different perspectives. Cam Levins is in the film. I should mention that for Canadians. He's a fairly substantial player in the film, actually. Well, he had 4 years with Salazar, right? And kind of interesting years too, good and bad.
That'll be interesting for Canadians and even for Americans, because Kara and Steve Magnus and others have been quite vocal about their experience with Nike, with Alberto Salazar. Cam hasn't. He's been quiet, and I've always respected that, but I was always interested in knowing more about what went on there. So that's interesting that you got him in the movie, in the documentary. So let me ask you this. I know you did already allude to the idea that you leave it up to the viewer come to their own conclusion. But that was actually one of my questions was, are you answering any questions here, or are you giving more perspective that perhaps unbelievably is not out there already?
I think that's a good question. I like one of the challenges in doing a film about track and field is to make sure that the film appeals to people beyond people who understand track and field. Like you and I follow the sport like daily. Like I'm on Let's Run or I'm on like different sites. You know, I understand the sport well. But telling a story about a guy that if you went down the street and said, "Do you know who Alberto Salazar is?" Most people, 99 out of 100 people, unless they run and get Runner's World delivered every day into their inbox, probably don't know who the guy is, right? So I had to, the challenge in this film was making an intriguing story. Is this man a hero or a villain? And that's my journey in the film, was to present that and to make people understand who this character was. I mean, he was a world record holder in 2000 in 1981, and he runs a 2:08 marathon in on the New York City course in 1981. Like, this guy was incredible. So he ran a minute faster than the Canadian record 40 years ago. So I mean, there is some debate on how long exact that course was, because it was a world best at that time. But it's a fascinating story, and so I needed to step back as somebody who loves the sport and not deal with every detail about the sport, and deal with him as a character has risen to the top of a sport I love. And how did I do that? I think I tried to make an epic tale of him representing this epic company and ask the questions. So like, do I break new news? I think there'll be some people will see some new things. I interviewed also like commentators, like Alex Hutchison's plays a fairly significant part in the film, framing up the story as he saw it as a science journalist as this was happening. From the ban on. Malcolm Gladwell's a big character in the film, who has written on Salazar. He actually spent time with Salazar at Park City, Utah. He's written for the New Yorker about Salazar, and he's quite frankly, I think, a bit fascinated with Salazar. So he plays a big part in the film. So there's lots of Canadian content, interesting people in this film trying to frame up who Salazar is. So you know, will some runners say, "Hey, you didn't break some piece of news. We expected to find syringes on a lake." You know, I'm not gonna say what I did find, but I'm gonna say that I think they're gonna have a perspective on Salazar's completely different than the way they went into it. I really do believe that.
So
So
that's a great point. I'm glad you said that, because you got to sell the documentary here to viewers. And it's interesting that you know, you had mentioned that if you talk to the average person on the street who's not interested in athletics at all, they probably won't know who Alberto Salazar is. Similarly, nobody, and in fact, many joggers and mid-pack runners have no idea who Bekele is, who did have the world record, as you know, for 16 years in the 5,000 and 10,000 meters. Yet everybody will know who Mo Farah is. Everyone loves a champion. So this company is a champion company, and Salazar is a champion, and people like to knock their champions down too. So it's interesting, though, that you know, you feel that people have a new perspective on Alberto Salazar once they've watched your documentary.
well, I think Salazar is a individual that It for sure in track and field. I'm like, I can't wait till the message boards on Let's Run attack me. It doesn't matter which side they are on Salazar, I'm going to get attacked and I'm ready for it. Come at me. You know, I did my homework. I've presented my case. If you have a different case, go do yours. But I can tell you this, that's like when CBC, a bunch of like people at CBC watched the fine, what's called a fine cut, there was incredibly good response. So these are people who do not understand track and field. And I can tell you the Hot Docs Festival has picked it as, like, again, I mentioned this earlier, but it's one of the top films. But all the people I've talked to there have nothing to do with track and field. They've never even heard about this guy. And the good news is the story seems to be hitting the mark. So it's kind of like, I guess, if somebody watched the Tiger Woods documentary on HBO, which is just fantastic, by the way. If you didn't know who Tiger Woods was, you probably would have heard of him, but you might not have known all the details. And I hope that people who are beyond this sport grab it and go, wow, that was like an interesting journey through this world. And you get a glimpse of the elite world and like how incredible it is and how kind of screwed up it is too. And I also don't shy away from the alpha fly and the vapor fly story. There's a good chunk on the film about that.
Okay,
Because
and
I
what
was there at
perspective?
the U.S. Olympic trials when they gave out the alpha fly. I was actually in the room where they did it. So that story has become the biggest story in our sport, obviously. And you know, I link that story back to the Salazar story in some ways. I mean, again, I'm hoping people will watch the film and see what I've done. But it's an interesting story in itself. There could be a documentary on that itself. So
I was just gonna say that it's almost a different story, or not, a separate story, and but it's linked obviously. So when you talk about the super shoes in the documentary, do you have a perspective and an opinion in that, or do you also leave that up to the viewer to decide whether it's right or wrong?
I think we all kind of know part of the story, but I have an amazingly good tale about the 2016 when the shoe was still hidden. Nobody knew about it until late 2017. And then the rumors were, well, is this thing really doing what it's doing? And it's almost in 2018 where, you know, people start going, whoa, there is something to these shoes. I speak to Jared Ward, who came sixth at the Olympics. And of course, the three people who came 1, 2, 3 were wearing the shoe. Did it affect the finish? How about when Amy Craig and Shailene Flanagan ran it, and in 2016 they wore them in the trials as prototypes. And Kara Goucher, who had spoken up against Nike, was wearing Skechers. She finishes 43 seconds behind. Yeah, I mean, it's behind third place, right? So like looking back, I mean, we can make the argument that it might have affected the impact of that race. It's hard to know. So I explore that pretty, I think it's a really interesting piece of the film. Again, it's not the Salazar story, but it is about Nike pushing the envelope again on something that has it's totally transformed the sport of track and field. I mean, every company is in a shoe war right now, trying to get their shoe. And it'll be interesting even at this Olympics this summer if a lot of the athletes who are wearing other shoes are going to wear the Nikes. I mean, everyone knows that's going to be an issue. So that's how impactful that story is.
So, would you suggest that the narrative has switched from concerns of doping to what shoes are they wearing and how effective are they?
Well, I think we could make the argument that Salazar's looking for that 1%, right? He's looking for that little edge to gain an inch, and these shoes are giving you a second and a half a lap. I mean, I was looking at the stats. Yes, actually last night I was looking at 14 kids in the NC2As have run under 13:30 for a 5K already. Like, the most that's ever happened in another year, I think, was 4. Like, this is the kind, like, okay, I can say these kids are training harder, they're training smarter. This effect of them learning from, I don't know, you know about this, the internet effect of them learning from program to program and understanding what to do. But 14, so like 14 kids running that fast, does anyone think the shoes aren't affecting this? Like, I, I'm sorry, but this is part of the story. And if you're not wearing those shoes, you're at a disadvantage. Unfortunately, the question becomes, what do you do with the record books? I think that's the big question is, do you have like pre-shoe times and post-shoe times, or do you just accept that, those pre-shoe times are, they're just never going to be as fast as, Dathan Ritzenheim said to me, he ran 60 flat in a pair of shoes with 4 millimeter drop. He goes, if I had 40 millimeters, knowing what I know now, would I have run 58:30 instead of 60 flat? He goes, I don't know. He goes, I probably wouldn't have been as injured as I was throughout my career. And he's probably right about that.
Yeah, well, that is interesting that that you mentioned that. What do we do with the records? Because as you talk about people accepting it, and that you know any athlete who wears them, you have two perspectives. I don't think it's yes, it is good, no, it is bad. I think it is defend it because I have a contract, or the other is acceptance and saying and putting it out there, like Des Linden and her 50K records. Yep, they helped. And Canada's Natasha Wodak with the national record, the 10,000, says, yep, it helped in her marathon in Chandler, Arizona. So I think there's two perspectives on that. Do you get that out in the documentary?
Yep. Yes, I do. And I've quite a few people I spoke to actually who didn't make the edit. Like Ryan Hall had a very good perspective on this. I should post it, actually. It was a really interesting interview with him. He didn't come in the film just because the film, I started it as looking at this sort of fine line of sport, of like, where's the fine line between cheating and fair play? Like, and I wanted to go deeper into the shoes, but then everyone kept talking about Salazar and the film, it was just became so obvious what the story was to me, that I had to change the focus of the storytelling on the show, in the film. And yeah, I think most athletes, I'm quite good friends with Melindy Elmore, actually. I've known Melindy for a long time, and she's married to one of my best friends, and Graham Hood, who was a national champ. And they talked about it like openly, like, yeah, we gotta, like, you can't ignore this thing if you're going to try and make the Olympic team. If it can get you an extra 3 miles further down the road in a marathon before your legs start to crash and burn, God, I wish I had those when I ran my marathons. The biggest critic of it in my film is probably Tim Hutchings. Yeah, he's been very vocal. He's for people who don't know him, he's the NBC's, he's the international TV commentator. You hear him on all the meets. And he just thinks this is crazy, that we're in the shoe war, not a running war. Jake Riley flat out says, spoiler alert for the film, but he just says, like, would I have made the Olympic team if I wasn't wearing them? And he goes, I'd like to think that I would have, but he goes, I don't, I gotta be honest, I think they helped. So, so let's be honest, like, people who wore those shoes have been doing very well in the marathons for a number of years. And I think some of the other shoe companies are catching on and getting there. Cam Levins has to run in Hoka, and he seems happy with them, but are they as good as Nike? I don't know. I haven't seen the data on that yet. We'll see. I think the biggest question about them is, are some athletes getting an advantage far greater than another athlete? I think the high responder thing is going to be an issue, and that's going to be too bad for the people who don't respond well to them, because I do think, how do you ever catch up? Like, you're going to be in a race, But Jim Ryan ran 144 on a cinder track with spikes that looked like a pair of socks. So I don't know. There's incredible athletes out there, in 1966.
Let's wrap this up. Tell us when and where a viewer can watch
Sure.
Nike's Big Bet.
Well, okay, again, I don't know when this airs, but April 29th till May 8th, it'll be at the Hot Docs Festival, DOC, doc, like documentary, Hot Docs. Everyone says dog if you don't know, but it's Hot Docs. .ca. You just have to write Nike's Big Bet and the tickets will come up and they can watch it and stream it. Then after that, it depends where people are watching this. It will be broadcasting around the world. It should be on Sky UK, I think in May. So Sky Sports and Sky Originals, which is their documentary strand, will be airing it. It will be on CBC, and then in the US, I can't speak about where it's going to be, but it will be on in the US. We're still in discussions with 2 different networks in the States.
So thank you, Paul Kemp, for joining me here today to talk about Nike's Big Bet.